My name is Isaac Romero. Today I will be discussing what interventions I think have a greater effect on human trafficking. I will also be mentioning how important the role of NGOs is in this fight against trafficking in persons. According to the UNODC, the ultimate goal between legal initiatives and the cooperation between organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, is to prevent potential victims from falling prey to traffickers, protecting those who do, and punishing the criminals who commit the crime of trafficking in persons. Governments must be involved both to steer the process and to strengthen their capacity to fight human trafficking. And non-governmental organizations and other civil society groups must protect victims and raise awareness among vulnerable groups. As the UNODC states, these groups are the eyes and ears of the global community, the front line of the anti-trafficking movement, and member states can help each other in the fight against human trafficking, as long as there's cooperation between these civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, and the member states themselves. Now, these groups should continue to advocate and galvanize a global, broad-based movement into action. UNODC also states that private companies should be active participants within their own communities and spheres of influence. The chance of success is greater when they work together. Some examples of the roles of different groups include the following brief list of NGOs and governmental organizations and their description of what they do. The UNODC is a guardian of the UN Protocol Against Trafficking in Persons. UNICEF promotes the protection of children from violence, abuse, and exploitation. The ILO promotes the protection against forced labor and preventing child labor. The IOM promotes the protection of migrant workers. The OHCHR is the custodian of the anti-slavery legal instruments. And the OSCE is fighting human trafficking in its own region. One of the possible legal interventions that I believe would help serve as a deterrent for human trafficking is Executive Order 13627, strengthening protections against trafficking in persons in federal contracts. According to the Office of the Federal Register, President Barack Obama authorized and signed EO 13627 with a clear intention to help protect vulnerable individuals, i.e., victims of trafficking, against contractors and subcontractors that perform vital services and manufactured goods procured by the United States. The order also states that, as the largest single purchaser of goods and services in the world, the United States government bears the responsibility to ensure that taxpayer dollars do not contribute to trafficking. By providing our government workforce with additional tools, training to apply and enforce existing, and by providing additional clarity to government contractors and subcontractors on the steps necessary to fully comply with that policy, I think orders like these, i.e., EO 13627, would significantly diminish the pervasiveness of trafficking by contractors and other officials. At the same time, I think if laws like this were enforced globally and applied not only to labor trafficking supply chains and services, but also within the sex trafficking industry, then trafficking overall would be diminished. For example, Sadiq Kara contends that a lack of risk combined with a demand and supply cycle will continue to hinder the eradication of trafficking. So, Kara insists that until the market force of risk is increased radically, then trafficking will remain immensely profitable. Such a law, if adopted on a global scale, would be effective if and when states work collectively towards taking the steps necessary to help criminalize trafficking and also penalizing it, not just in the individuals at the employer level or pimps in the street, but also above the trade network, all levels of trafficking, from government officials to who have the power to hire contracting companies, or influential citizens with a significant purchasing power as well. And now, an order or law like EO 13627 would impose a threat to would-be traffickers that would have the power to hire contractors and would use millions of taxpayer dollars for services performed on behalf of their respective government. The threat of losing money and improving best practices and penalizing companies, while also including the education for employees by NGOs of how to recognize human trafficking, I think would also lead to a reduction in trafficking. In 2006, Cam Simpson wrote, in the Chicago Tribune on contractors committing the crime of trafficking. Simpson wrote that the top U.S. commander in Iraq has ordered for sweeping changes for privatized military support operations after confirming violations of human trafficking laws and other abuses by contractors involving possibly thousands of victims whom are foreign workers on U.S. bases. Simpson then added that there were steps taken against these companies whom were suspected or found guilty of committing human trafficking by threatening to withhold contracts against them. Furthermore, once it was determined that such practices violated U.S. law against trafficking, the commander, General George Casey, ordered that contractors be required to return passports to the victims. The passports had been illegally confiscated by the employers and had done so at U.S. bases. Laws like H.R. 3244, Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000, establishes human trafficking and related offenses as federal crimes and attaches severe penalties when they are committed. Now, it also mandates restitution be paid to victims of human trafficking. The law further works to prevent trafficking by establishing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which is required to publish the Trafficking in Persons or TIP report each year. An Executive Order 13627, which established Federal Acquisition Regulation Council, shall take the steps necessary to ensure that the efficacy of the government's zero-tolerance policy on trafficking in persons by federal contractors and subcontractors and solicitation services, including supplies or contractor employees, from engaging in trafficking-related activity, such as using misleading recruitment practices or failing to disclose important information or making material misrepresentation regarding key terms and conditions as wages, the location of the work, and housing conditions, and any costs to be charged to the employees, if applicable, are all under the guidance or guise of the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council. Now, Part 6 in Transparency in Supply Chains under the Modern Slave Act of 2015 is another good example of a law that should be followed. This portion of the Act requires that companies comply with completing a yearly human trafficking statement. According to the Act in Part 6, a slavery and human trafficking statement is one that shows how a company takes the steps of the organization in taking during the financial year to ensure that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in any parts of its supply chains and in any parts of its businesses, or that businesses that the organization reports that it has not taken any steps. Now, an organization's slavery and human trafficking statement may include information about the organization's structure, its business and supply chains, its policies in relation to slavery and human trafficking, its due diligence processes in relation to slavery and human trafficking in its business and supply chains, the parts of its business and supply chains where there is a risk of slavery and human trafficking is taking place, and the steps it has taken to assess and manage that risk. Furthermore, a report can include the company's effectiveness in ensuring that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in its business or supply chains, measured against such performance indicators as it considers appropriate. And this one I also believe is really crucial for the employees, because a company must report or should report the training about slavery and human trafficking availability to its staff. Now, these laws should be enforced at a global scale to ensure that trafficking is diminished. It would ensure that companies, contractors, government officials be compliant with the law. And a good example of the importance of prosecuting every single person charged with the commission of the crime at any level of government or power is mentioned in an article by Reuters. Sebastian Malo states that a former Kentucky campaign official for Donald Trump was charged with human trafficking. Timothy Nolan, a former judge, was found to have forced 19 victims to perform sex acts, including 7 who were minors under the age of 16. The crimes took place between 2010 and 2017, and many of the victims were addicted to heroin, some were young runaways, some were already at treatment centers that he had visited. Assistant Attorney General Barbara Whaley, the special prosecutor in this case, said Nolan would pay or threaten the victims, saying he could use his authority to get them in trouble with the parole officer, take away their children, or take away the children, or have them arrested. Nolan told his victims that no one would ever believe them, and if they said what he did to them, they would be also punished. Now, he was found guilty, and Nolan must take a sexual offense class, submit to a HIV test, and a DNA sample. His conditions of his plea of guilt also required him to become a registered sex offender for life. He was ordered to have no contact with the victims, engage in no social media, and view no pornography of any kind. If he is released from prison, he will spend 5 years on probation and will need approval to be with or around children. And I think this was really important as well. Nolan will also pay $110,000 in asset forfeiture to the Human Trafficking Victims Fund. These penalties are a good example of what happens if a person with power or influence uses their influence to commit human trafficking, is then caught, and then anti-trafficking law is enforced. Thus, when prosecuted, regardless of that person's stature in society, the victims are assisted. And in this case, through the Victims Fund, justice through the court system, and hopefully the victim services programs assisted them as well. Now, although I believe that an internationally adopted and enforced set of laws would help deter human trafficking, I think the simultaneous involvement of NGOs play an equally important role in the policymaking group. They inform the world of this crime and mobilize people to stop it. These organizations provide reports and provide feedback on reports and follow-ups given to them at roundtable meetings and memorandums. They also make recommendations on the implementation of conventions. NGOs help with data-driven measurement tools, which take into account where money is being made, how many victims or how victims are being trafficked, and how consumers are contributing to the issue as well. Organizations like the Polaris Project serve victims and survivors through 24/7 national human trafficking hotlines, while also coordinating with referral partners nationwide as a national access point for trauma-informed support. The project states that it is building one of the largest public data sets on human trafficking in the United States, while they also claim that it's aiding them to learn how the business of human trafficking really works in real time. The Polaris Project also enlists law enforcement and other public and private sector partners, thus helping the project bring anti-trafficking strategies into the real world to support survivors, prevent and disrupt human trafficking at a large and global scale. Another organization like the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, or ICAT, has sought to draw out the complex, multiple, interlinked, and changing modalities of trafficking processes, while also seeking to promote the coordination of cross-agency strategies, which we have been seeing is so crucial in the fight against human trafficking. The group's work has aimed to increase the relevance and robustness of multi-sectoral responses through a series of issue papers focused on topics such as preventing trafficking, more effective use in international legal instruments, understanding practices that contribute to the demand for trafficked labor, and promoting common counter-trafficking priorities. Now, according to the Council of Europe, titled Action Against Human Trafficking in Human Beings, the website states that pursuant to Article 35 of the Convention, parties shall encourage authorities and officials to cooperate with non-governmental organizations and other relevant organizations and members of civil society groups in establishing a relationship or strategic partnerships with the aim of achieving the purpose of the Convention. Organizations like Know the Chain have established themselves as partners crucial to the success in creating anti-trafficking policy and laws. For example, Know the Chain has conducted studies that relate to the requirements mentioned in Part 5 and Part 6 of the Modern Slavery Act. Although there is no direct correlation between the group and the creation of the Act, nevertheless, it is indicative of the relationship between or among NGOs, policymaking, and government, just how the Council of Europe Article 35's recommendation or requirement that the government work together with these groups. This is kind of that in action. The data tool that they use in the Know the Chain group their website states that they believe that through their benchmark data tool, they can help ensure that companies remain on target in providing the best conditions for workers, as well as ensuring the proper labor standards, and give companies and investors examples of good practices. The data tool measures several themes of a company's business. For instance, the NGO claims that the benchmark methodology's 7 themes were selected to capture the key areas where companies need to take action to eradicate forced labor from their supply chains: commitment and government, traceability and risk assessment, purchasing practices, recruitment, worker voice, monitoring, and remedy. These 7 themes have a total of 23 indicators. For each theme, a company can score a total of 100 points. The Know the Chain website states that their existing benchmarks, such as the Access to Medicine Index for the pharmaceutical sector, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark on human rights issues, and the Ranking Digital Rights for the ICT, have demonstrated how their approach can drive tangible improvements in companies' policy and practice. Well, these are only a few examples. I hope that this best highlights how governments, laws, and NGOs together play a crucial role in the efforts against human trafficking. I think that the UNODC really had a great point when they said that together is how we stop human trafficking, and it requires several organizations and agencies, governmental and non-governmental, to complete that. Thank you very much.